Don't go home. Stay where you are. My father has never sounded afraid a day in his life. Not when he ran into burning buildings. Not when he stood in a hospital hallway waiting for news about my mother's surgery. Not even when he retired from the fire department after 32 years and had to learn how to sit still in a quiet house. But that night his voice was trembling. I was sitting in my car outside Stead. Catherine's medical center, hands still gripping the steering wheel, the ache of a 12-hour shift pressing into my bones. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead. My scrubs smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee. My feet throbbed in that deep pulsing ray. Only nurses understand, the kind that travels up your calves and settles behind your eyes. Dad, I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. What's wrong? Leia, he said again, lower this time. Urgent. Don't go home. Do you hear me? Stay where you are. The world seemed to narrow around those words. Every instinct inside me tightened. I glanced toward the highway that led to my little house in Maplewood, the same quiet neighborhood I'd moved into 3 years ago because it felt safe. Tree-lined streets. Porch lights that stayed on late. Elderly neighbors who watered their lawns at sunrise. Dad, you're scaring me. I know, he breathed. I could hear wind in the background, the familiar creak of his old truck door. Just trust me. Pull into somewhere public. A gas station. Anywhere with lights. I'm on my way. My chest felt hollow. My father was not a man who panicked. He was the calm one, the steady one. When Mom died 10 years ago, it was him who held me together. He'd sat on the edge of my bed and said, "We don't get to choose the fire, Leia." Layer? Only how we walk through it, and now he sounded like he was standing in one. I started the engine without thinking. Instead of turning toward Maplewood, I drove 2 blocks down to a brightly lit gas station on the corner. The fluorescent lights flickered harsh and white against the night sky. A teenage boy leaned against the store window, scrolling on his phone. An older woman pumped gas slowly, glancing at me once, then away. I parked near the entrance and locked my doors. "Dad," I whispered into the phone. "What is going on?" There was a pause, too long. Then he said, "Mrs. Alvarez called me. She saw someone break into your house." My breath caught so sharply it hurt. "What?" She said. "A man forced the back door. She thought it was you at first, then realized it wasn't. She called the police. She called me. I could hear the sirens then." Faint in the distance, growing louder. "Leia," he said, his voice steadying now in that firefighter way. "Stay exactly where you are." I turned in my seat, and from across the small rise beyond the gas station, I could see the faint glow of red and blue lights flickering against the night sky, coming from the direction of Maplewood. It didn't feel real. My house was small. White siding, pale blue shutters. A tidy little porch with 2 wicker chairs, it found at a yard sale. I'd planted lavender along the walkway last spring. I had folded laundry on my couch, a half-read novel on the kitchen table. My life inside those walls, and now police lights were flashing there. I watched as squad cars sped past the intersection. My hands began to shake. "What if they're too late?" I whispered. "They're not," my father said firmly. "They got there fast. I'm almost there." My throat tightened. I tried to imagine what was happening inside my house. A random burglary, maybe. Someone desperate. Someone high. But something in my father's tone told me it wasn't random. Minutes later, though it felt like hours, I saw more flashing lights crest over the hill. I stepped out of the car before I realized I had unlocked it. The cold air bit at my face. Kundet. From the distance, I could make out movement. Officers. Shadows. A figure being escorted out of my house in handcuffs. I stopped breathing. The man looked ordinary. Mid-30s, maybe. Dark hoodie. Head down. One officer held his arm tightly as another searched him. "That's him," my father's voice said beside me. I hadn't even noticed his truck pull in. He stood there, tall and broad, shouldered despite his gray hair, jaw clenched tight. His eyes were fixed on the scene across the rise. "Dad," my voice cracked. He placed a steady hand on my shoulder. You were not supposed to walk into that house tonight. The words sank in slowly. The police cars continued to flash, bathing Maplewood in red and blue. I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. Like the house across the way wasn't mine. "What do you mean?" I asked. He swallowed. "The police found him inside. He wasn't stealing. He wasn't rushing. He was waiting for me." A coldness spread through my body that had nothing to do with the night air. "They said he had photos of you," Dad continued quietly, "printed out, laid across your kitchen table." I covered my mouth with my hand. "Photos of me? How would he even?" "I don't know," Dad said, "but he was armed." The world tilted. "Armed," I repeated. "They found a knife on him. And something else." His jaw tightened again. "He wasn't there for your TV. Leia." My mind raced backward. The last few weeks. The strange feeling of being watched when I pulled into my driveway. The car I thought I'd seen twice at the corner but dismissed. The unfamiliar number that had called and hung up without speaking. I had told myself I was being dramatic, overtired, imaginative. Nurses see worst case scenarios for a living. We are trained to prepare for them, not expect them at our front doors. I stared at the flashing lights in the distance, realizing something that made my stomach twist. If I had driven home like I planned, if I had walked into my dark kitchen and flipped on the light, he would have been there, and I would have been alone. My father squeezed my shoulder gently. "You trusted me," he said. I didn't answer because I couldn't. My eyes were locked on my house, my safe place, now wrapped in police tape. Trust. It was such a simple word. Something we use every day without thinking. That night it was the only thing standing between me and something I couldn't even bring myself to name, and I had almost ignored it. Before that night, my life had been painfully ordinary in the best possible way. I worked, I came home, I slept, and I did it all again the next day. Nursing has a rhythm to it, long stretches of exhaustion followed by small, quiet victories that most people never see. A patient breathing easier, a hand squeezing yours in gratitude. The hum of machines that means someone made it through the night. I liked that rhythm. It kept my world predictable. My house in Maplewood was part of that predictability. It wasn't big, and it certainly wasn't impressive, but it was mine. The front porch caught the morning sun just right, and on my days off, I'd sit there with coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up. Mur Henderson across the street walked his dog at exactly 6:30 every morning. Mrs. Alvarez watered her roses like it was a sacred ritual. Safe. That was the word everyone used for Maplewood. After my mother passed away, I think I needed that feeling more than I realized. Hospitals are full of uncertainty. People come in thinking they have time, and sometimes they don't. I saw too many lives change in a single phone call, too many families blindsided by things they never saw coming. At home, everything felt controlled. My father, Mason, checked on me more than he admitted. He'd stop by with groceries. I didn't ask for or fix things that weren't broken. A loose cabinet hinge, a porch light that flickered once. He never said he worried, but I knew he did. Losing Mom changed him. It made him quieter, more watchful. "You work nights," he'd say casually while tightening a screw or adjusting something unnecessary. "Just making sure everything's good here." I used to tease him about it, told him he needed a hobby now that he wasn't running into burning buildings anymore. But the truth was, I liked knowing he was nearby. I didn't have much of a personal life outside work. A few dates here and there that never went anywhere. Most people didn't understand nursing hours, or maybe they just didn't understand me. I was tired often, protective of my time, content with solitude in a way that sometimes worried my friends. Still, my routines filled the space. Sunday meal prep, laundry folded while watching old movies, calling Dad on my drive home after late shifts, ordinary things that stitched life together quietly. Looking back now, I try to pinpoint when things started to feel different. At the time, it didn't seem important, just small moments. A car parked down the street longer than usual. I remember noticing it one evening as I pulled into my driveway. The engine was running, headlights off. I hesitated for a second, then told myself I was being paranoid. The car drove away before I even reached my front door. Another time, I found my back gate slightly open. I assumed I'd forgotten to latch it. I was tired enough that week to forget plenty of things. There were phone calls, too. Unknown numbers that hung up when I answered. I figured it was spam. Everyone gets those. The human brain is very good at protecting itself from fear. We explain things away because the alternative feels too heavy. And nurses, especially, learn to compartmentalize. If we allowed every strange feeling to grow into panic, we'd never function. So I ignored it. I went to work. I smiled at patients. I came home and locked my doors and believed that was enough. Sometimes, though, there were moments when the silence in my house felt thicker than usual. I'd pause in the kitchen, listening, convinced. I'd heard something outside, the creak of wood, a faint shift near the back fence. Nothing was ever there. I told myself it was just exhaustion. My father noticed changes before I did. He always did. "You sleeping okay?" he asked one afternoon while we ate takeout at my kitchen table. "Yeah," I said automatically. He watched me for a moment longer than usual. "You look tired." "I am tired. That's my whole personality now." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You ever feel like someone's watching the house?" he asked casually. I laughed it off. "Dad, you sound like a crime podcast." He didn't laugh. "Just asking," he said, and changed the subject. At the time, I thought he was being overprotective. A retired firefighter with too much time to imagine worst-case scenarios. I didn't realize he was noticing things I had trained myself to dismiss. The truth is, nothing obvious ever happened. No broken windows, no threats, no clear warning sign that danger was already inching closer. Just a feeling. And feelings are easy to ignore when life is busy. The week before everything happened, I remember standing in my driveway after a late shift, too tired to move. The neighborhood was silent, porch lights glowing softly. Somewhere, a dog barked once and stopped. I had the strange sensation that I shouldn't turn my... I told myself I was being ridiculous. I ran inside anyway. That was the last week my home felt completely safe. Later, the police would ask me dozens of questions. Had anyone followed me? Had I noticed anyone at the hospital? Any patients who seemed overly interested? Anyone from my past who might hold a grudge? I kept saying no, because my life wasn't dramatic. There were no enemies, no messy relationships, no obvious reason for someone to fixate on me. That was what made it so terrifying. Sometimes danger doesn't announce itself. It just quietly studies your routines until you stop noticing it altogether. And I had standing in that gas station parking lot that night, watching police lights swallow my street, I began to understand something that made my chest tighten with guilt. Maybe the signs had been there all along. Maybe I just didn't want to see them. After the police took the man away, everything moved in slow, careful steps, like walking across broken glass. An officer approached my father and me at the gas station first. He spoke calmly, professionally, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the kind that comes from knowing how badly something could have gone. "Miss Sullivan?" he asked. I nodded, my arms wrapped tightly around myself. "We'd like you to come down to the station later to give a statement. For now, we'd prefer you not return to the house tonight." The words landed heavier than I expected. Not return home. Home suddenly felt like a place that belonged to someone else. What was he doing there?" I asked. My voice sounded distant, like it wasn't mine. The officer hesitated for a moment. He entered through the back door. No signs of forced struggle. He appears to have been inside for some time. "How long?" my father asked sharply. "We're still determining that." I swallowed. "Did he take anything?" The officer shook his head. "No. That's what concerned your neighbor. He wasn't moving through the house like a burglar. He was settled. Settled. The word made my stomach turn. He explained that officers found photographs spread across my kitchen table, some printed from social media, others taken from a distance, me leaving for work, carrying groceries, unlocking my front door. Pictures I didn't even know existed. I felt my legs weaken again. "How long has he been watching me?" I whispered. "We don't know yet," the officer said gently. "But based on what we've seen, this wasn't random. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed at my father's house, curled up on the same couch where I'd fallen asleep as a teenager after late-night movies. The familiar smell of his home, coffee, old leather, faint wood smoke, should have comforted me. Instead, my mind replayed every ordinary moment of the past few months, now poisoned with new meaning. Had he been watching when I watered my plants, when I laughed on the phone with a coworker in the driveway, when I came home exhausted and too tired to check behind me? The idea made my skin crawl. Around 3 in the morning, I found my father sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a mug of coffee gone cold. "You should try to sleep," I said quietly. He shook his head. "Couldn't." I sat across from him. For a while, neither of us spoke. "I almost told you to move closer to me last year," he said finally. I frowned. "Why?" "Just a feeling." I studied his face. The deep lines around his eyes looked heavier than usual. Guilt sat there, plain and unspoken. "Dad," I said gently, "you saved me tonight." He didn't look relieved. "I almost didn't. What do you mean?" He rubbed his hands together slowly. "Mrs. Alvarez called me first, said she saw someone go into your backyard. I thought maybe it was a maintenance guy, or you'd hired someone." He swallowed. "I almost waited to see if the police called instead." My chest tightened. "But you didn't." "No," he said quietly. "Something didn't feel right. That was the thing about my father. Decades of walking into dangerous situations had sharpened something inside him. Instinct. The ability to sense when normal wasn't normal anymore. Hey, Pack. H-tick. H-tex. And for the first time, I realized how often I had dismissed that instinct as overprotectiveness. The next day at the police station, the reality became even harder to process. The detective laid the evidence out carefully. Photos, notes, a small notebook filled with observations about my schedule. What time I left for work. What days I worked late. When my lights turned off at night. I felt sick reading it. "He believed he knew you," the detective explained. "This kind of fixation builds over time. Often the individual creates a version of the person in their head. But I don't know him," I said. "We're still investigating how he first noticed you, possibly through the hospital, possibly online." The idea that my ordinary life had been quietly studied by a stranger made me feel exposed in a way I couldn't explain. Then the detective said something that stayed with me long after I left. "He wasn't planning to leave when you came home." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" He chose his words carefully. "Based on the layout and what we found, it appears he intended to confront you." The room felt suddenly too small. My father's hand tightened on my shoulder. Confront. The word echoed in my mind as images forced themselves forward, unlocking my door, stepping inside, setting down my bag, turning on the kitchen light, seeing someone already there, waiting. I couldn't breathe for a moment. That was when the truth fully settled in. I hadn't escaped by luck. I had escaped because someone who loved me paid attention when I didn't. In the days that followed, neighbors stopped by with casseroles and soft voices. Maplewood, the safe neighborhood, suddenly felt fragile. People checked locks. Porch lights stayed on longer. Mrs. Alvarez cried when she saw me. "I almost didn't call," she said, gripping my hands. I didn't want to seem nosy. I hugged her tightly. "I'm glad you did." But beneath the gratitude, something inside me had shifted. Safety no longer felt automatic. It felt earned, fragile, and trust, real trust, suddenly carried a different weight. Because the truth was, when my father told me not to go home, every logical part of me wanted to ignore him. I was tired. I wanted my bed, my shower, my routine. If I had followed logic instead of instinct, I don't know if I would be telling this story now. And that realization was harder to live with than the fear itself. The discovery didn't end that night with flashing lights and handcuffs. It unfolded slowly, in layers I wasn't prepared for. 3 days after the arrest, I was allowed back into my house under police supervision. I remember standing on my front porch, staring at the door like it belonged to someone else. The lavender I'd planted swayed gently in the breeze, as if nothing had happened. The world looked painfully normal. Inside, it felt different. The air was stale, heavy. The back door had been repaired temporarily, but I could still see where the frame had splintered. I walked carefully into the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. Even though the police had taken most of the evidence, faint outlines remained on my table where stacks of photos had been spread out. A small indentation in the wood where something sharp had pressed down. I imagined him standing there, touching my things, breathing the air in my house. My stomach twisted. He stayed in the living room for several hours, the officer explained quietly. We believe he entered in the early evening. I would have been at work, charting patient vitals, laughing with a coworker about hospital cafeteria food, completely unaware that a stranger was sitting in my living room, waiting. In my bedroom, I paused at the doorway. Nothing had been stolen, nothing overturned. My bed was still neatly made from that morning. My laundry basket sat in the corner, half full. It was almost worse that everything looked untouched. On the dresser, the framed photo of my parents stared back at me. Dad in his old fire department jacket. Mom smiling softly. The detective's words echoed in my mind. He wasn't planning to leave when you came home. I stepped backward, suddenly unable to stand in that room another second. Outside, my father was speaking with one of the officers. His posture was straight, protective. I realized then how close he had come to losing me without even knowing it. Later that afternoon, the detective called us back to the station. They had identified the man. His name was Daniel Harper, .to 36 years old. No violent criminal record. A few minor offenses, trespassing, disorderly conduct, but nothing that would have set off alarms. He worked odd jobs, lived alone. He first encountered you at the hospital, the detective said. I frowned. I don't remember him. He was treated in the emergency department 8 months ago. Minor injury. You were assigned to his room briefly. 8 months. My mind raced through faces. Hundreds of patients passed through those doors. I tried to picture him lying in a hospital bed, injured, vulnerable. I would have just been doing my job, I said quietly. The detective nodded. Sometimes that's enough. They found entries in his notebook describing me in detail. The way I spoke, the way I tucked my hair behind my ear when I concentrated, the time my shift usually ended. It felt invasive in a way I didn't have words for. He appears to have developed an attachment, the detective continued carefully. An imagined relationship. But he knew I didn't know him, I said. It wasn't a question. Yes, the word sat heavy between us. I thought about that night again, the knife, the waiting. What would he have done? I asked, barely above a whisper. The detective held my gaze. We can't say for certain. But based on what we recovered, it likely would have escalated. Escalated. That word followed me home, though home now meant my father's guest room. I stopped sleeping through the night. Every small noise jolted me awake. I checked locks obsessively. At work, I found myself scanning faces differently. Watching hands, listening for tones that didn't match words. Patience. I would once have approached with easy warmth, now received cautious professionalism. It scared me how quickly fear can change you. One evening, I sat across from my father at his kitchen table again. The same table where we'd eaten countless meals over the years. I keep thinking about that moment, I said, when you told me not to go home. He looked up from his coffee. I almost argued with you. He gave a faint smile. You sounded like you wanted to. I did, I admitted. I thought maybe you were overreacting. I was exhausted. I just wanted my bed. He leaned back slowly. But you didn't argue. I shook my head. No, why? I thought about it carefully. Because you've never asked me to do something like that before, I said. And your voice. I've never heard you sound like that. He nodded once. Trust isn't. It's built quietly over years of small, consistent moments. My father had shown up for me in 1,000 ordinary ways. Fixing porch lights, driving across town when my car battery died, sitting beside me in hospital waiting rooms. So when his voice trembled that night, something inside me listened. I didn't know that listening would save my life. A week later, news of the arrest spread through Maplewood. People looked at me differently. Some with sympathy, others with a kind of wary curiosity. It felt strange being the center of a story I never chose. But what unsettled me most wasn't the neighborhood whispers. It was the understanding that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary man in a hoodie, sitting quietly in your living room, and sometimes the only reason you survive is because someone who loves you refuses to ignore a feeling they can't explain. And Tamadin. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. Every ordinary step of that night felt monumental in hindsight. The decision to pull into the gas station, the way my father's hand had rested on my shoulder, the distant flicker of police lights approaching Maplewood. I found myself walking in circles around my father's living room late at night, coffee mug in hand, trying to make sense of how close I had come to something catastrophic. It was almost unbearable, the knowledge that if I had ignored his voice, if I had followed my fatigue-driven instincts instead, I might not have come back to that couch, that room, that safety. I kept thinking about Daniel Harper, the man who had invaded my sanctuary. The ordinary man who could have taken something from me, I could never replace. I wanted to feel anger, but it was tangled with something more profound, a shattering awareness of vulnerability. The sense of normalcy I had taken for granted now seemed fragile, almost illusory. I started taking precautions. I changed my locks. I installed a security camera at the back door, lights that turned on automatically at night, a home alarm that buzzed in my pocket whenever the doors opened. Even so, every step into my empty apartment felt deliberate, careful. The sense of being watched lingered like a shadow at the edge of vision. At work, my coworkers noticed. "You okay?" one nurse asked gently. "You've been jumpy lately." "I'm fine," I said, though my hands shook slightly as I charted medications and checked vitals. But I wasn't fine. I was aware of the fragility of safety in a way I had never been before. The ordinary rhythms of my life, the locks, the porch lights, the small neighborhood chatter, had suddenly acquired the weight of defense, of survival. Yet amidst the fear there was a strange, quiet sense of power. The power wasn't in me alone, not entirely. It was in the bond I shared with my father, the unspoken, instinctive trust that had saved me that night. I realized that our relationship had always been ordinary, filled with everyday gestures and small routines, but that ordinariness had built a foundation sturdy enough to keep me alive when everything else threatened to fall apart. One afternoon, a week after the arrest, my father and I went back to my house together. The police had cleared it, removed the remaining evidence, and made it safe. My lavender plants still swayed in the gentle breeze, as if untouched by the terror they had silently witnessed. I unlocked the door, paused in the entryway, and looked around. My kitchen table, the scene of the invasion, looked ordinary again. My half-read books sat where I had left them. The couch cushions were plump and inviting. It was home again, but it carried a new meaning. "Do you feel safe?" my father asked quietly. I hesitated. "Not like I used to," I admitted. He nodded slowly. "That's understandable. But you will again. You just need time, and you need to remember something important." "What's that?" I asked. "That trusting the people who love you isn't weakness," he said. "It's strength." I thought about that. About how my instinct had screamed drive home and my father's had screamed the opposite. About how the night had unfolded, how the ordinary man with a knife had been stopped, not by my vigilance, but by the vigilance of someone who cared more about me than their own comfort. "And I don't think I'd survived without you," I whispered. He smiled faintly. "You would have fought, of course, but sometimes fighting alone isn't enough. Sometimes survival depends on connection." That afternoon, I sat on the porch and breathed in the familiar smells of home: lavender, freshly watered soil, the faint aroma of baked bread from a neighbor's kitchen. For the first time in days, I felt a measure of calm. But it was a different calm, one tempered by awareness, by the knowledge that life could change in a single ordinary moment. I thought about Daniel Harper again, about the ordinary face that had concealed danger, and about the extraordinary ordinary bond that had kept me alive. I realized that trust isn't given lightly. It isn't a simple act of belief. It is earned, nurtured, and sometimes, as in my case, it is life-saving. Over the following weeks, the legal process unfolded. Daniel was charged with attempted assault, trespassing, and possession of a weapon with intent to harm. In court, his own words revealed a delusional fixation on me, an imagined connection that he believed justified his actions. He was ordinary in appearance, but inside, a dangerous fantasy had grown unchecked. Meanwhile, my father and I re-established our rhythms. We cooked together on Sunday nights. He still drove me to work when my car needed repairs. He still checked on me in the small, ordinary ways that meant the world. But now, there was an unspoken understanding, an awareness that ordinary acts could carry extraordinary weight. I returned to my house fully a month later. I unlocked the door carefully, checked every window and corner, and finally exhaled. Sitting at my kitchen table, I realized how fragile life had been that night, and how strong it could be when trust and love were present. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since college. I wrote about fear, about safety, about the ordinary gestures that had saved me. I wrote about my father, about how a lifetime of care had culminated in a single trembling phone call that changed everything. And I wrote about myself, about the decision to trust, about the courage it takes to listen, even when exhaustion and logic argue otherwise. That night, I slept fully for the first time since the incident. The lavender on my porch swayed gently in the breeze, the way it always had, and for the first time, I felt that ordinary safety returning, not naive, not blind, but aware, deliberate, and earned. I realized something else. Life is fragile, yes, but so is trust, and so is love. And when those bonds are respected, nurtured, and acted upon, they can be more powerful than any fear, more protective than any wall, more enduring than any ordinary day. When word got out in Maplewood, I could feel the neighborhood watching. Not in a judgmental way, mostly just cautious eyes, the kind that quietly measure and re-measure safety after a scare. People I had waved to for years suddenly lingered in doorways when I passed, offering small smiles and careful hellos. Some asked questions directly, as if hoping I could offer answers they didn't have. "Are you okay? Do you feel safe? Was it really as scary as it sounds?" I told them the truth, as best I could. But how do you describe that shattering awareness that someone had studied your every routine for months, that your home, the place you thought untouchable, had been violated without a single warning sign that made sense? At work, the hospital staff handled it delicately. Colleagues expressed concern, and some offered to cover shifts if I needed space. But the truth was, I wanted normalcy. I wanted to feel like myself again. Nursing had always been my anchor, a way to immerse myself in life and care for others, while forgetting the fragility of my own world. Still, something inside me had changed. I noticed more than before, the subtle glances of strangers, the way someone lingered at a doorway, the smell of a room, and what it said about who had been there. My caution wasn't paranoia. It was awareness, and awareness saved lives. That much. Daniel Harper became a story beyond our household. The Maplewood community learned about him through the local paper and small news outlets. People were shocked at the meticulous nature of his planning, the way he had silently and deliberately followed me into the very routines I thought were private. Some expressed disbelief that such danger could exist so quietly in someone ordinary. I attended the preliminary court hearings with my father by my side. He didn't need to speak for me. His presence alone was a protective force. Seeing him there, quiet and strong, I felt the enormity of what had been between us that night. It wasn't just instinct, it was a shared bond. A trust built over decades of love and attention. That bond had not only prevented tragedy, it had brought the whole situation into the light. The trial revealed more unsettling details. Daniel had a fixation pattern consistent with stalker behavior. He had mapped my schedule, observed my movements, and even noted the times my father would typically check in. But despite his obsession, it was Mrs. Alvarez's courage in calling my father that tipped the balance. She had noticed him, ordinary and unassuming, crossing the yard and entering the back of my house, and she had acted immediately. Without her action, without my father's attention, without my choice to trust him, the story would have ended differently. And Harper's demeanor was eerily calm, almost mundane. No rage, no theatrics, just ordinary, quiet, disquieting fixation. The prosecutors presented photos, notes, and witness statements, but his ordinary appearance in the courtroom felt chilling against the backdrop of his intentions. Ordinary people can harbor extraordinary danger, I realized. Ordinary moments can carry the weight of life or death. The day of sentencing, I sat in the courtroom with my father beside me. He didn't touch my hand this time. He didn't need to. His quiet presence was enough. When the judge read the charges and imposed the sentence, I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering fear. Justice had been served, but the awareness of vulnerability remained. Returning home after the trial, the neighborhood seemed quieter than ever before. But the normal rhythms of life had returned in small ways. The dog barked. Mrs. Alvarez waved as she tended her roses. Mr. Henderson walked his dog at 6:30, as always. Maplewood's calm was restored, but with a new layer of collective caution. At home, I took the time to restore my space with intentionality. I replaced locks, added security cameras, and installed motion sensor lights. But more than physical precautions, I restored my sense of boundaries. Awareness had become as much an internal shield as any door or alarm, and the bond with my father had deepened. We found ourselves sharing moments more intentionally. Sunday dinners, quiet walks, long conversations about life and vigilance. It wasn't fear that guided these moments. It was gratitude, trust, and a recognition of how precarious life could be. I realized that a family's love and attention could be a force stronger than danger itself. Over time, I started sharing my story selectively, quietly, with close friends and coworkers. Not for attention, but to offer insight about the importance of vigilance, trust, and community. The message became clear. Ordinary lives can harbor extraordinary danger, but ordinary courage, love, and attention. I still feel a pang of anxiety when I walk into my house alone at night. I check doors and windows more thoroughly than before. But now, there's also a calm presence within. A knowledge that I survived something most people never imagine, thanks to trust, quick action, and the unwavering bond with my father. Through it all, I learned that safety is rarely absolute. It is a mosaic of vigilance, intuition, and love. And while fear can't be fully erased, it can be tempered with the quiet strength of those who care for us, who notice when we might not, who act before tragedy can strike. It took weeks, maybe months, before the tension that had settled in my chest began to loosen. I started sleeping through the night again, though I still double-checked locks before bed. Maybe won it. It wasn't fear that made me cautious anymore. It was respect for the fragility of ordinary life, and a deep understanding of how easily it could be taken for granted. Returning fully to my house in Maplewood was a quiet reclamation. I opened windows to let in sunlight and fresh air, hung laundry on the line like I always had, and made coffee in the morning, letting the scent fill the kitchen. I allowed myself to breathe, to feel my home as mine again. Slowly, I started smiling at the small, ordinary things I had overlooked. The lavender in bloom, the dog barking in the neighbor's yard, the soft creak of my porch in the wind. These sounds were comforting now. They reminded me life was continuing, ordinary yet precious. Work also became a place of healing. My patients never knew the shadow I had narrowly escaped, and I liked it that way. But I noticed myself connecting more deeply with those I cared for, perhaps because the vulnerability of life had become so real to me. I moved through my shifts with the quiet knowledge that each day was a gift, that each interaction mattered more than I had realized before. Even my father noticed the change. One evening, while we sat on his porch drinking tea, he said, "You've softened around fear. You've learned it doesn't control you." I smiled, leaning back in my chair. It's more than that. I feel more aware, alive, I guess, and grateful. He looked at me with that familiar quiet intensity that had always grounded me. Grateful for what? For you, I said without hesitation. For trusting me enough to save me. For noticing when I couldn't. He exhaled. A long, slow breath. You know, sometimes love is the only shield we get. Sometimes instincts aren't just for emergencies. They're for life. Those words stayed with me. I reflected on them often as I walked through my neighborhood. as I cooked dinner alone, as I settled into my favorite chair with a book in hand. It wasn't that danger had disappeared, or that the memory of Daniel Harper could be erased. It was that I understood the extraordinary power of ordinary relationships, the kind that quietly watch over us, the kind that act before we even know action is needed. I also reached out to Mrs. Alvarez, the neighbor who had first noticed something wrong. She and I shared a quiet lunch one afternoon, swapping stories about ordinary neighborhood life, the small joys, the garden mishaps, the way Maplewood moved through the seasons. When I thanked her for calling my father, she shook her head. "Oh, honey, I just did what I thought anyone would do," she said. But I could see it in her eyes, the same awareness, the same quiet courage that had changed everything for me. In the weeks and months that followed, Maplewood returned to normalcy. Neighbors waved again without hesitation. Porch lights were left on as usual. Children played in driveways. Life moved forward. And yet, for me, something essential had shifted. I no longer took my safety or my ordinary routines for granted. I understood in a visceral way how quickly life could tilt from ordinary to catastrophic. But I also understood the weight of trust, the strength of bonds built over years, and the power of instinct guided by love. One evening, I found myself on my porch again, watching the lavender sway in the wind. I held a mug of coffee between my hands, savoring the warmth. The street was quiet. The world smelled faintly of damp earth and distant rain. I thought about my father, about Mrs. Alvarez, about the police officers who had acted so quickly. I realized that safety isn't just about locks and alarms. It isn't just about vigilance. It is about connection, awareness, and the courage to act when ordinary life feels threatened. It is about noticing the tremor in a loved one's voice and trusting it, even when every other instinct says otherwise. And as I sat there, breathing in the familiar night air, I made a silent promise to myself. I would never underestimate the ordinary people in my life, the ones who care enough to notice, to act, to protect. I would never forget how fragile life could be, and how resilient it could become when guided by love and trust. Because in that quiet, ordinary moment, I understood something profound. Danger is real. Fear is real. But love, instinct, and trust, those are life-saving forces too. Sitting on my porch that night, watching the lavender sway and listening to the soft hum of Maplewood at rest, I realized how fragile one ordinary evening could have ended in tragedy. One simple choice, staying where I was instead of driving home, saved my life. And that choice was guided entirely by trust. Trust in my father, trust in his instincts, trust in the bond we had built over decades. It's strange how we go through life assuming safety is something permanent, something we can rely on without thought. We forget that ordinary moments, pouring coffee, walking to the mailbox, laughing at dinner, are gifts. And we forget that sometimes the people who care for us are the quiet shield standing between us and danger. I often think about Daniel Harper, the ordinary man who became a threat simply because no one noticed him before it was almost too late. And I think about my father and Mrs. Alvarez and the police officers, ordinary people who acted at the right moment and saved me without fanfare. Their vigilance, their care, their courage made all the difference. I share this story not to frighten, but to remind us all, listen to the people who love you, pay attention to your instincts, and honor the ordinary relationships that quietly protect you. Sometimes, the life-saving moments are subtle. Sometimes, the heroism is quiet. Would you have trusted someone's instincts the way I did? Would you have stayed in the car, even as every instinct screamed to run home? Think about that, because sometimes trust is more powerful than fear, and sometimes it's all that stands between life and loss. And if this story touched you or made you reflect on the ordinary bonds that keep you safe, consider sharing it with someone you love. And for more stories that explore the quiet strength of trust, courage, and family, please subscribe and follow.